In life, we have a tendency to view events as being attributed to either good or bad luck. Falling on ice might be considered bad luck, while finding a penny might be considered good luck. Winning the lottery would probably be considered to be one of the luckiest experiences a person might have, unless your name is Jack Whittacker. You see, for Jack, winning $300 million was not only one of the worst things to ever happen to him, it was also the worst thing to ever happen to his family too. It would lead to Jack becoming the target of countless lawsuits. He was targeted by thieves, his house was set on fire, and it would cost both his daughter and granddaughter to lose their lives. Some West Virginians like to tell the joke of the hillbilly who died smiling. His family asked the medical examiner, "What'd he die of, doc?" And the ME would reply, "He was struck by lightning." "Well, then why was he smiling?" They would continue. The examiner would sigh and reply, "Well, he thought he was having his picture took." Jack was a businessman who owned a construction firm in West Virginia. It was a successful business which had already given him a net worth of around $17 million. People who knew Jack described him as friendly, honest, and generous. On Christmas Eve 2002, Jack, like many other hopeful souls, bought a state lottery ticket. Being an already wealthy man, Jack didn't play the lottery often, only when the prize money was more than $100 million. And tonight's jackpot was the biggest single prize in history, $314 million. Little did he know that this ticket would change his life in drastic ways, which he would later come to regret. When you win the lottery, you're usually given two options for receiving your newfound bounty. Either an annuity for the full amount of winnings, or a smaller lump sum payment which you receive all at once. Both are subject to taxes in the USA, as Brits are a bit more lucky, as gambling and lottery taxes don't exist here. For Jack, this meant either accepting $314 million in annual payments, or a $170 million lump sum. There are many steps one should take when winning the lottery for large amounts of money. And don't worry, I'm going to tell you what they are. When good old Jack woke up on Christmas morning, he realized that Santa had brought him a tad more than a couple of candy canes that year. Upon checking his ticket, he had hit the jackpot, and $314 million was awaiting his collection. There is a very obvious reason why you should not tell anyone when you win the lottery or come into any large amount of money. When people know that you have a massive amount of money, they will immediately begin trying to separate you from it. They'll use emotional blackmail, they will beg, they will have a once-in-a-lifetime business investment idea that just can't lose. Jack was a nice old soul, and really did want to share his good fortune, so he was featured in local, state, and national news features and did some very generous things with the money. He set up multiple foundations to help people in need. He donated to many churches. He spent $14 million setting up a foundation which would distribute food and clothing to low-income families throughout West Virginia. He even went back to the store where he bought the ticket and bought a house, a car, and gave a $44,000 check to the woman who sold him the ticket. Jack pretty much announced to everyone that he was the lucky recipient of the biggest ever lottery win. And for anyone living under a rock who didn't see all of that, he drove through his neighborhood in his new Lamborghini, throwing piles of cash out the windows as he went. About a year after Jack's incredibly generous, if a little foolhardy behavior, is when the first problems began to happen. Jack hadn't really changed his habits all that much since winning, and still returned to that same convenience store every morning to buy fresh-made biscuits made by the kind lady from whom he had bought the ticket. Except now, whenever Jack was there, so were a few other people too. In an interview given to the Washington Post years later, Biscuit Lady Brenda recalled how scores of people would wait at the store to meet Jack, with stories of children who had cancer or a dying sibling. They would tearfully beg Jack for help, and Jack, being the nice chap he was, would listen to every story and try to find a way to help. But day after day of his favorite spot being accosted by people begging for his money began to take a toll on Jack, and pretty soon he stopped going there. When they realized that he stopped coming to the store, they would stalk his house. They'd ring his phone and ask for money, and when Jack refused, they would start to threaten him. Eventually, Jack hired off-duty deputy sheriffs to provide security for him and his family. One thing had been revealed true. Whether you like it or not, massive wealth brings massive attention, and it's rarely positive. When you become this rich, you should hire a lawyer. It should probably be the first thing you do. You'll see why soon enough. Go to a big city law firm, one you've never worked with before. Demand a partner to represent you, and tell them how much money you have, and their insistence on a junior representing you will quickly change. Then with this lawyer, set up a series of trusts which will hand out smaller amounts of money on a regular basis to friends and family, as a supplement to whatever their income already is. Don't give them cash, and don't make it unconditional. Double whatever salary they earn, or pay 90% of their college tuition. But always make sure that they too have a vested interest in working hard for the money that you'll give them. Don't consult with any family member when deciding all of this. If you consult even a single one, they can use that as basis for a lawsuit in which you were unduly influenced and drag you through courts, wasting your time and money. Now Jack had a daughter called Ginger. Ginger had a daughter of her own called Brandy. Jack and Brandy were very close. Before the lottery win, they would talk every day. She would get off the school bus and call Jack on her phone to tell him about her day at school. They would have movie nights together, stretched out on the bed with popcorn. Like Jack, Brandy was described as nice, friendly, and very down to earth. According to her friends at the time, after the lottery win, it was not unheard of for Jack to give Brandy $5,000 whenever he saw her. Pretty soon after the security concerns, Brandy was pulled out of school for fear that she might be kidnapped to hold to ransom. The family had also moved into a mansion so big that when it was being built, locals had assumed it was a hotel. Inside this extravagant new prison, Brandy became isolated from her friends and from society in general. Over time, Brandy began to turn to drugs as a method of dealing with her isolation. As part of her security detail, Brandy's friends had begun driving her around in her car, and in return Brandy began giving expensive gifts and cash to those friends in exchange for driving her around. At first, they would drive to shopping malls and buy clothes and electronic goods and feed themselves on hundreds of dollars worth of junk food. Over time, Brandy began scoring crack and smoking it in the back of the car as her new friends would drive her around. Plenty of boys dated Brandy, and each were given expensive gifts by Brandy, and some were given portions of the money that Jack would give to her. To the boys, it was just easy money. Help keep Brandy on crack, and they guaranteed their own income at the same time. For one such boy, called Jesse, dating Brandy would be the worst mistake of his life. Initially, Jesse had been one of the kinder friends of Brandy who had tried to encourage her to ditch the drugs. She repeatedly bought his silence with gifts and cash, and eventually, he stopped hanging around with Brandy and worked for his dad instead, thinking that Brandy was a bad influence. One day, Jesse went to buy some lunch and never came back. The following day, they found his body, dead from a drugs overdose. At the funeral, Brandy's former entourage blamed her for the death and repeatedly threatened her. All these issues began to place a wedge between Brandy and her family, and gradually, they grew apart. The only time Jack saw his granddaughter was when she came to collect her daily allowance. In December of the same year, Brandy didn't show up to collect her allowance, and Jack knew that she was dead. 11 days later, police found her body wrapped in plastic and dumped behind an abandoned van. After slowly retreating from general public life, after being chased for money by every man and his dog, Jack began frequenting a local strip club called the Pink Pony. Jack made a few mistakes while frequenting the establishment. The first was to slap 50 grand in cash on the counter. The club manager advised Jack that was a mistake, as the types of characters who were sitting around the club were likely to try and separate him from his money. Jack did as he was told and put the money away, but it was his intention to spend all 50,000 of those lucky dollars in that strip club that night. While some may criticize Jack's use of the money for the purchase of a dancer's time, Jack had decided after his 8th pancreatitis operation in 8 years that his time on this earth was limited, and that he'd enjoy it, whilst also trying to do as much good with that time as possible. But, as is usually the case, the money began to change poor old Jack. Pretty soon, local residents, particularly the ones who frequented or worked in the strip clubs, began to notice a change in Jack. He went from being a well-dressed and well-mannered, generous cowboy to being an unkempt and somewhat lecherous rich old man. On March 24, 2003, a drunken and disheveled Jack was involved in an incident which would become one of many lawsuits. While gambling at the Tri-State Racetrack and Gaming Center, Jack was spotted with a woman who was not his wife, though she did seem to be in Jack's company by choice. While the woman played the slot machine with Jack's money, Jack was attempting to get lucky in a very different kind of slot, and was spotted fondling the woman in full view of the other customers. His public display was interrupted, however, when the woman got lucky on the slot and it began to furiously spit out tokens for her. A casino attendant named Rhonda Lilly then crouched down to help the woman collect her winnings. Lilly alleges that Jack grabbed the lady's hair and then also grabbed her ass as well. Another attendant reported on the same night that Jack would grab her head and move it toward his crotch while she was refilling a slot machine. The girl who was serving Jack that night, Kitty French, also claims that Jack kept snapping her bra, and reflected later that in just the space of a few hours, she went from viewing Jack as a West Virginia hero to just thinking he was an obnoxious rich jerk. Jack would of course deny the allegations and later settle out of court. Jack was a frequent customer of the Pink Pony strip club, and the dancer's manager Misty would come to comment on the change in Jack's character as well. Initially, after winning the lottery, Jack was a gregarious chap who wanted to share his good fortune with others, but over time, his attitude shifted into one in which he believed the money gave him power and authority over others, and was quoted as saying, "I'm Jack Whittacker. You'll do what I say because I have more money than God." Misty remarked that Jack was like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, so corrupted by the status he believed it gave him that it became to define who he was. The club had to assign a special security to Jack while he was with the dancers because Jack was increasingly developing wandering hands and fingers during the dancers' performance, believing that paying for their time was the same as paying for their body. Despite how impolite and egotistical Jack behaved, all the staff were extra nice to him, which probably encouraged and perpetuated his new, more cynical and ego-driven persona. Jeff Kaplinger was the assistant manager of the Pink Pony Club, and the same man who had earlier told Jack to be more careful with his money in the club. He took glamour shots of the dancers for the club and was saving up money to start his own promotions business. His partner was the aforementioned Misty, who managed the girls in the club and was a former dancer herself. One night in August, about 8 months after winning the lottery, Jack wandered into the Pink Pony as he usually did. Only this time, Jack had in his possession a black briefcase which he left in the front seat of his Lincoln Navigator. He quite loudly let it be known that inside said briefcase was $500,000 in cash. Perhaps thinking back to all the times when vulgar Jack would grab the dancers, Misty muttered, "Someone should rob him." Misty herself had at times been subject to Jack's grabby hand behavior, and had also watched as his money often helped him avoid punishment from management. And according to one of the bartenders, she had dumped the contents of 2 blue capsules into Jack's drink that night in an attempt to knock him out so her partner Jeff could head outside and break into Jack's car to steal the briefcase. Jeff left the briefcase hidden behind a dumpster, intending to retrieve it later, but police would later find it after Jack alerted them to the theft. Remember Brenda, the nice biscuit-making employee where Jack bought his winning ticket? You might imagine that after receiving a house, a car, and $40,000 in cash from Jack, that her life would be all set. But soon, she would come to learn that you might have the money to buy into a rich neighborhood, but it doesn't mean they'll let you stay there. The house Jack had bought for her was a very nice one in a wealthy part of town, and as a quiet and polite couple, she and her boyfriend had assumed there would be no problems. Unfortunately, the residents of said neighborhood seemed to take problem with someone from a poor background moving into their community, and began digging for ways to evict the couple. Sure enough, they eventually discovered that Brenda's boyfriend was on probation for a sex offense. Brenda knew all about it and believed that everyone makes mistakes and it's how one reacts to mistakes, rather than the mistake itself, which is important. The residents began distributing flyers around town announcing the news, which had people avoiding Brenda and shunning her. At first, she just assumed it was the natural reaction to finding out her boyfriend's criminal history. But this was actually just the method by which they would harass the couple. The reason was a little more simple: jealousy. While in a store, she overheard one of her harassers talking to another person about how they had all worked so very hard to buy their house in the community, and a white trash resident had simply had it handed to her. A few weeks later, Brenda sold the house she had been so excited to own and moved away, opting instead for a home in a poorer part of town where people would live and let live. Although the list of unfortunate events which befell Jack also included his house being set on fire, being robbed multiple times, and repeatedly being sued by a variety of people, it was the death of his granddaughter which hurt Jack the most. Perhaps because it could be said he was at least partially responsible due to his habit of showering her with riches that a life of poverty had never prepared her to handle. Money can buy a lot in life, but even the vast sum that Jack had won could not help him prevent his daughter Ginger from succumbing to her long battle with cancer. The money brought little joy to Jack or the people who surrounded him, and he was often overheard tearfully admitting that he wished he'd torn the ticket up instead of claiming the huge prize. Then, at the age of 72, Jack himself passed away due to natural causes. Maybe the scandals and lawsuits finally took their toll. Perhaps the years of drinking and nightlife had worn him down. Or, just maybe, old Jack had finally realized that the real happiness for him would be to be reunited with his loved ones. The only thing that money couldn't buy.